Well, hello, my name is Bill Simpson. I'm at my cabin in scenic and picaresque Russell Gulch, Colorado. It's a beautiful September afternoon. Our aspen trees are just beginning to change, and I've been seeing wild turkey and some deer. So, last time we talked about William of St. Thierry's project in De Natura et Dignitate Amoris, and that project is to show how grace builds on nature, how our true nature teleologically unfolds into the divine image, and that this self-unfoldment is enabled and fostered by the embrace of natural human affection. So that's William's picture. And what I want to do this afternoon, on this fantastic September afternoon, is talk about how William reimagines St. Benedict's 12 degrees of humility. Now, these days, if you look into the literature for the formation of Benedictine monks and oblates, it's extremely difficult to find a description and a discussion of the 12 degrees of humility. And that's the 12 degrees of humility that you find in the 6th century rule of St. Benedict. So, for example, here's a copy of the Benedictine handbook produced by the Liturgical Press. That's St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. And there are plenty of fine essays in here and a nice translation of the rule. Yeah, there's essays on the office, on Lectio Divina, prayer, all these things. Nothing on the degrees of humility. Here's the same publisher's manual for Benedictine oblates. And again, more very fine essays. The Benedictine oblate and creation, serving in the local church, Benedictine oblates in interreligious dialogue, retirement, aging and death. But again, nothing about the degrees of humility. So let's turn to the rule of St. Benedict itself. Here's how Benedict introduces his discussion. This is on page 27 of this version of the rule. It says, "Accordingly, brothers, if we are going to reach the highest summit of humility and speedily reach that heavenly exaltation that is won through the lowliness of this present life, our ascending actions must set up a ladder, such as the one that appeared to Jacob in his sleep when he saw angels descending and ascending. That descent and ascent signifies nothing else other than that we ought to descend by exalting and ascend by humbling ourselves." And then Benedict gives us a list of 12 stages or rungs on that ladder. And here's the list. Now, the first degree of humility says that the monk should go about with the consciousness of fear of God and hell. Benedict says, "Let him recognize that God is always looking down on him from heaven, and that all his actions, wherever he may be, are in clear view to the eye of God, and that at every hour are presented to him by his angels." Now let me show you a couple of images that pick up this notion of being under the divine gaze. First, here's a picture of the eye of God from my family's church in Prevelia pod Krimen, southwest of Ljubljana in Slovenia. It's a 16th century church. Second, here's a picture of Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. Now, Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1842, designed the Panopticon as a jail in the round that was supposed to reform prisoners by creating an environment in which they could never be certain that they were not being watched, under the eye of God. Now let me show you a few more features, and Benedict clearly regards these as features, not bugs, in this ladder of humility. For example, the 7th degree of humility says that for a monk must not only pronounce with his tongue, but also in his very heart believe himself to be the most abject and inferior of all, humbling himself to say with the prophet, "But I am a worm and hardly human, scorned by everyone and despised by the people." And then the 7th degree, the 10th degree, says no laughter. The 10th degree of humility is not to be easily moved and prompted to laughter, for it is written, "A fool raises his voice in laughter." And finally, the 12th degree of humility is for a monk not only to have humility in his heart, but to show it physically for all to see. So that whether he is doing the work of God in the oratory, the monastery, the garden, or on a journey, or in the field, or wherever he may be, whether he sit, walk, stand, let him always, with his head bent down and his eyes fixed upon the earth, think of himself as guilty for his sins and about to be presented before the dreadful judgment of God. So you see, by the time we get to this 12th degree of humility, the monk is almost like a broken prisoner. So I think we can appreciate the discreet silence of the contemporary manual makers. But I don't think the situation was any less fraught for William of St. Thierry back in the 12th century. Because remember, the point of On the Nature and Dignity of Love is to illustrate the role of natural affection, that's amor, in the spiritual journey, and that it culminates in a return to our origin in the hidden face of God. It's a picture of grace building on nature as opposed to driving out nature with a pitchfork. And in this sense, William's aims seem very consistent with what we know today about psychological health. For example, if you're a psychiatrist and a patient tells you, "I am a worm and no man," best practices say, go for the prescription pad. Well, the good news is that William sets out an alternative to Benedict's really grim conception of monastic perfection. And I think I can go into the text of De Natura Dignitate Amoris and identify a positive monastic virtue that will correspond to each of Benedict's degrees of humility. And here's my table comparing Benedict's degrees with William's moments of monastic growth. Now, let's look briefly at a few of the pairings to get a sense of what William's on about. Later on this lecture, I'll look at a couple of the crucial pairings in more detail. But notice, corresponding to the 8th degree of humility, that is, plain observance of the rule, William says, not plain observance, fraternity, brotherly love for the other monks. And he sees fraternity as a variety of caritas or agape, as opposed to amor. However, he identifies the initial mystical experiences, or theophanies, that novices might have with amor, and these he pairs with Benedict's 6th degree. Okay, remember the 6th degree is contentment with the lowest and most menial treatment. Now, as for self-abnegation, I am a worm and no man, William pairs this 7th degree of humility with the first flowering of caritas, and that first flowering of caritas we experience in love of our parents. And I can't help but think that William has Jesus' words from the 18th chapter of Matthew's Gospel in mind. "Except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven." So the stance here is not one of self-reproach, but of curiosity, openness to growth, trust, all the things that a happy child has, and that allows the child to grow and become whole.